Jimmy Hoffa was halfway through ordering his breakfast at that Detroit diner when he noticed the gun. Not pointed at him, not yet. Just resting on the table in front of a man sitting 3 booths away. The weapon lay there next to a half-empty cup of coffee and a folded newspaper, casual as a pack of cigarettes. The man holding it was someone whose name got whispered in Detroit streets, but never spoken out loud. A man whose presence in any room changed the temperature. Hoffa stopped mid-sentence with the waitress. She followed his gaze, saw what he saw, and her face went pale. The diner, which moments before had been filled with the clatter of silverware and the murmur of morning conversation, fell silent. Everyone in the place seemed to sense that something was wrong. The kind of wrong that got people hurt. And then Jimmy Hoffa did something that would either make him a legend or get him killed. He handed the waitress a $5 bill, told her to keep the change, and walked straight toward the man with the gun. Not hurrying, not hesitating, just walking like he was headed to shake hands with an old friend. When he reached the booth, he slid into the seat across from the man without asking permission. The man with the gun didn't move, didn't smile, didn't acknowledge Hoffa's presence at all for a long moment. Then, slowly, he picked up his coffee cup and took a sip, his eyes never leaving Hoffa's face. To understand what happened in that Detroit diner in 1964, you need to understand what Jimmy Hoffa was. Not just who he was, but what he represented. You need to understand the world he lived in, the rules he played by, and why a man like him would walk toward a gun instead of away from it. Detroit in 1964 wasn't like other American cities. It was a place where power had many faces, and not all of them were legitimate. The auto industry gave the city its public face, its wealth, its reason for existing. But underneath that gleaming surface ran darker currents. Organized crime had its fingers in everything: the docks, the warehouses, the unions, the politicians. And at the center of it all was the Teamsters Union. The Teamsters weren't just a labor organization. They were an empire. With over 1.5 million members across the country, they controlled the movement of goods throughout America. If the Teamsters decided not to move something, it didn't move. That kind of power attracted attention from people who understood how to use power for their own purposes. And at the head of this empire sat James Riddle Hoffa. Jimmy to his friends, Mr. Hoffa to everyone else, and something much less polite to his enemies. Hoffa hadn't been born into power. He'd clawed his way up from nothing, and he'd done it the hard way. His story started in Brazil, Indiana, a small town where opportunities were scarce and survival meant working from the time you could walk. When Hoffa was 7 years old, his father died. The family had nothing. His mother, Viola, was left to raise 4 children on her own in the middle of the Depression. There was no safety net, no government assistance, no family wealth to fall back on. There was only work, and even that was hard to find. Hoffa's formal education ended in the 9th grade. Not because he was stupid, he was anything but because his family needed whatever money he could bring in. At 14, he got a job at a Kroger grocery store warehouse, working the loading dock for 32 cents an hour. It was brutal work, the kind that broke men's backs and spirits. The workers would show up at dawn and wait, sometimes for hours, to see if they'd get any work that day. When they did work, they were expected to move freight in all weather, in dangerous conditions, with no job security and no recourse if they got injured. The bosses treated them like replaceable parts in a machine. a sense, they were. But something in Jimmy Hoffa refused to accept that. He looked around at the other workers, men who came in every day with their heads down and their spirits crushed, and he saw something they didn't see yet. He saw that individually they were powerless, but together they were the entire operation. Without them, not a single crate moved. Without them, the business stopped. In 1932, in the depths of the Depression when organizing a strike could get you blacklisted or worse, 20-year-old Jimmy Hoffa convinced his fellow workers at Kroger to walk off the job. They wanted better pay, set hours, and basic safety measures. The company refused, so the workers struck. It lasted 2 days. The company couldn't afford to have their distribution center shut down. They gave in to almost all of the workers' demands. And in those 2 days, Jimmy Hoffa learned the most important lesson of his life. Organized labor was power, real power, the kind that could make men in expensive suits sit down and negotiate with men in work boots. The following year, Hoffa joined the Teamsters Union. He was 20 years old and had found his calling. Over the next 2 decades, he rose through the ranks. With a combination of genuine dedication to workers' rights, political savvy, absolute fearlessness, and a willingness to make deals with people that other union leaders wouldn't touch. Because the Teamsters, particularly in the Midwest, had always had complicated relationships with organized crime. The mob controlled the docks, the warehouses, and much of the shipping industry. Any union that wanted to operate in that world had to find a way to coexist with them. Some union leaders kept their distance, tried to maintain clean operations. Hoffa took a different approach. He understood that the mob wasn't going anywhere, so he learned how to work with them, how to use them when it benefited the rank-and-file members, and how to maintain enough independence that he wasn't simply their puppet. It was a dangerous game, walking the line. But Hoffa had grown up around tough guys. His childhood in Indiana had been spent in neighborhoods where organized crime was just part of the landscape. He understood these men. He knew how they thought, what they respected, what they feared, and he knew that the only way to deal with them was from a position of strength, never weakness. By 1957, Hoffa had consolidated enough support to be elected president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. He was 44 years old and commanded the largest, richest, and most powerful union in American history. The Teamsters pension fund alone was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That kind of money attracted attention from everywhere. Politicians, businessmen, law enforcement, and most significantly, the mob. The mob saw the Teamsters pension fund as a bank. They could borrow from it to finance casinos in Las Vegas, real estate developments, and other ventures that legitimate banks wouldn't touch. Hoffa approved many of these loans, sometimes because they made financial sense, sometimes as part of larger political calculations, and sometimes because refusing would have been dangerous. But Hoffa never let anyone forget who was in charge. He might do business with the mob, but he didn't work for them. He worked for the Teamsters. And that distinction mattered to him more than anything. This relationship, this delicate balance of power and mutual interest had worked for years. But by 1964, things were changing. The federal government, led by Attorney General Robert Kennedy, had launched an all-out war against both Hoffa and organized crime. Kennedy saw them as two sides of the same corrupt coin, and he'd made it his personal mission to take them both down. The pressure was intense. Hoffa was constantly under surveillance. His phone was tapped. His associates were being interviewed. Grand juries were convened. The government was building cases, gathering evidence, tightening the net. And in that environment, people got nervous. The mob was particularly concerned. If Hoffa got cornered, if he faced serious prison time, would he make a deal? Would he testify against them to save himself? Most men would. Most men, when facing 20 years in federal prison, would say whatever they needed to say to reduce their sentence. But Hoffa wasn't most men. Everyone who knew him understood that he'd rather go to prison than become an informant. It was a matter of principle, of identity. Jimmy Hoffa was many things, but he wasn't a rat. He'd die before he'd cooperate with the feds. Still, some people in the mob weren't willing to bet their freedom on Hoffa's principles. They wanted guarantees, or they wanted him gone. The trouble started on a Tuesday in early 1964. Hoffa was in his office at the Teamsters headquarters in Detroit, working through paperwork, when his secretary knocked on the door. Her name was Mary, and she'd been with him for years. She'd seen a lot in that time, had learned to read situations, to know when something was routine and when something was off. When she came in, Hoffa could tell immediately that something was off. She told him there was a man outside asking to see him. She didn't recognize him, but something about him made her uncomfortable. The way he carried himself, the way he looked at her when he asked for Mr. Hoffa. She'd worked around dangerous men long enough to recognize one when she saw one. Hoffa asked who the man said he was from. Mary hesitated, then said she thought he was associated with Tony Giacalone. She wasn't certain, but the man had that look. That particular look that men connected to the Detroit mob had. Tony Giacalone. Hoffa knew him well. They'd done business together for years. Tony was one of the mob's key players in Detroit, a man with connections that ran from the local crime families all the way to the National Commission. He was sophisticated, businesslike, and absolutely ruthless when he needed to be. Hoffa respected him, and more importantly, trusted him to keep his word. In their world, that meant something. Hoffa told Mary to send the man in. The man who entered was in his 30s, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. He moved with the kind of careful precision that suggested he was used to situations where movements mattered. His face was professionally neutral, giving away nothing. He introduced himself simply, no last name offered or needed, and said that Mr. Giacalone requested a meeting with Mr. Hoffa. Tomorrow afternoon, 3 o'clock, at the Red Fox restaurant in Northwood, a suburb northwest of Detroit. Hoffa asked what the meeting was about. The man said that Mr. Giacalone would explain when they met. It was a private matter that required a private conversation. Hoffa studied the man for a moment. In his position, you learned to read people quickly and accurately. This man wasn't nervous, wasn't aggressive, wasn't trying to intimidate. He was just delivering a message. A professional doing his job. That actually made Hoffa more comfortable than if the man had been trying to throw his weight around. Still, there was something unusual about the request. Normally, when Tony Giacalone wanted to talk, they'd meet at one of the usual places, often with other people present. A private meeting, just the two of them, at a restaurant out in the suburbs, that was different. Not necessarily bad, but different. Hoffa asked why they couldn't meet at his office, or at one of the downtown locations they usually used. The man simply repeated that Mr. Giacalone preferred a private location. The Red Fox was quiet, discreet, and away from the usual crowds. After a long moment, Hoffa agreed. "Tomorrow at 3. The man nodded, thanked him politely, and left. After he was gone, Hoffa sat at his desk thinking. His assistant, Chucky O'Brien, came in a few minutes later. Chucky had been with Hoffa for years, had grown up around him almost like a son. He was loyal, trustworthy, and had good instincts about people and situations. Hoffa told him about the meeting. Chucky's first question was why they were meeting at the Red Fox instead of somewhere more usual. Hoffa said he didn't know. Maybe it was about new loan arrangements. Maybe something to do with the Vegas operations. Maybe Tony just wanted to have a conversation away from the usual ears. But Chucky looked worried. He said that he'd been hearing things lately, whispers. People in the organization talking about how the federal pressure on Hoffa was making everyone nervous. Some of the mob families were getting concerned about what might happen if Hoffa got arrested, if he faced serious time, if he was put in a position where cooperation might seem like his only option. Hoffa laughed it off. He'd been dealing with pressure his entire career. This was nothing new. Robert Kennedy had been after him for years, and he was still standing. He wasn't going to let some whispers and rumors change how he operated. But Chucky persisted. He said this felt different. The atmosphere in the city had changed. People were tense. The usual relationships felt strained. And a private meeting with Tony Giacalone, away from the normal locations, that could mean anything. Hoffa appreciated Chucky's concern, but he wasn't worried. He'd known Tony for years. They'd done business together, had mutual interests, had maintained a respectful relationship. If Tony wanted to talk about something sensitive, fine. That's what private meetings were for. The next day, July 30th, 1964, was hot. The kind of oppressive summer heat that Detroit got in late July, where the humidity hung in the air like a wet blanket, and the sun beat down on the concrete until you could see heat waves rising off the pavement. Hoffa left his office around 2:15. He drove himself, which was unusual. Normally he had someone drive him to meetings, but Tony had specifically asked for a private meeting, and Hoffa interpreted that to mean just the two of them, no drivers, no assistants, no extra people. The Red Fox was about 30 minutes northwest of downtown Detroit, out in the suburbs where the streets were wider and the buildings lower. It was a decent restaurant, not fancy but respectable, the kind of place where businessmen met for lunch and families came for dinner. At 3 o'clock on a weekday afternoon, it wouldn't be crowded. Hoffa arrived at 2:45. He was always early to meetings. It was one of his habits, something he'd learned early in his career. Being early gave you time to assess the situation, to see who else was there, to be settled and comfortable when the other party arrived. He went inside, found a booth near the back with a good view of the entrance, and ordered coffee. The waitress was friendly, tried to make small talk about the heat, but Hoffa was preoccupied. He was running through possibilities in his mind, trying to figure out what Tony wanted to talk about that required this kind of setup. 3 o'clock came. Tony didn't show. 3:15. Still no Tony. By 3:20, Hoffa was getting annoyed. Tony Giacalone was a lot of things, but he wasn't someone who showed up late to meetings without a good reason. Something was off. At 3:25, the restaurant door opened, but it wasn't Tony Giacalone who walked in. It was a man Hoffa had never seen before. Younger, maybe late 20s, athletically built, with the kind of controlled movement that suggested someone who was very aware of his physical capabilities and how to use them. The man scanned the restaurant, spotted Hoffa, and walked directly to his booth. He didn't ask if Hoffa was who he thought he was. He just said that Mr. Giacalone was outside and wanted to speak with him in the car. Something had come up that required discretion. Hoffa asked why Tony didn't just come inside. The man said it was complicated, that there were people here who might recognize Mr. Giacalone, and the conversation needed to be completely private. It was a reasonable explanation, but something about it didn't sit right. Hoffa had been in enough situations to trust his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that something wasn't quite right about this. But he also knew that if Tony Giacalone had sent someone to get him, there was probably a legitimate reason. He stood up, left a few bills on the table, and followed the man outside. The parking lot was about half full. The sun was brutal, reflecting off car windows and chrome bumpers. The man led Hoffa toward a black Lincoln Continental parked in the far corner of the lot, away from the other cars. The windows were tinted dark enough that you couldn't see inside. As they approached the car, Hoffa felt a prickle of unease run up his spine. The same instinct that had kept him alive and out of serious trouble for decades was telling him to be careful, to pay attention, to be ready for anything. The man opened the rear passenger door. He gestured for Hoffa to look inside, said Mr. Giacalone was waiting. Hoffa stepped closer and looked in. Tony Giacalone wasn't there. Instead, sitting in the back seat was a man Hoffa recognized. Not someone he knew personally, but someone he knew by reputation. An enforcer. One of the men the Detroit mob used when they needed to send a message or handle a problem that required a particular kind of solution. And in the enforcer's hand was a pistol. Not pointed at Hoffa, not yet, but held casually across his lap in a way that made its presence impossible to ignore. Hoffa felt the man behind him move closer, blocking any easy retreat. His heart was pounding, but he kept his face neutral. Showing fear in a situation like this was the worst thing you could do. He asked what this was about. Where was Tony? The enforcer in the back seat looked at him with eyes that showed nothing. No anger, no sympathy, no emotion at all. Just the flat, calculating look of someone who'd done hard things before and wouldn't hesitate to do them again. He told Hoffa to get in the car. They needed to take a ride. Hoffa stayed where he was. He said that if Tony wanted to talk to him, they could talk right here. He wasn't getting in any car. The man behind him put a hand on his shoulder, not roughly but firmly, and suggested that getting in the car would be the smart thing to do. Hoffa's mind was racing. He understood what this was, or at least what it could be. A car ride to a secondary location with mob enforcers wasn't something you came back from. Once you got in that car, you were at their mercy. And mercy wasn't something these men were known for, but he also understood that if they'd wanted to kill him here, in the parking lot of a public restaurant in broad daylight, they would have done it already. The fact that they wanted him in the car meant something else was happening. Maybe they were taking him somewhere to kill him privately, or maybe, just maybe, they were taking him somewhere to have a conversation they didn't want to have in public. Either way, the situation was bad. But Hoffa had spent his entire life in bad situations. He'd faced down violent strikebreakers, corrupt politicians, rival union leaders, and mob bosses. He'd been threatened, beaten, shot at, and arrested more times than he could count. And he'd survived it all by never showing fear, by never backing down, and by understanding that in his world, respect was everything. So Jimmy Hoffa looked at the enforcer in the back seat and made a choice. He said that if he got in that car and didn't come back, a lot of people would know where he went and who he went with. He said that killing him would cause more problems than it would solve. He said that whatever message they wanted to send, there were better ways to send it. The enforcer listened without changing expression. When Hoffa finished, there was a long silence. The kind of silence where everything hangs in the balance, where the next few seconds determine whether you live or die. Then the enforcer spoke. He said this wasn't what Hoffa thought it was. Nobody was going to kill him today. But people needed him to understand some things. Important things. Things that couldn't be said over the phone or in a public place. Hoffa asked what things. The enforcer said he should get in the car and find out. Or he could walk away right now, go back to his office, and wait for whatever happened next. His choice. Hoffa stood there in that parking lot, the sun beating down, sweat running down his back, and weighed his options. He could walk away. But that might make things worse. It might make him look weak, might make people think he was scared. Or he could get in the car and take his chances. He got in the car. The enforcer moved over to make room. The man who'd brought Hoffa from the restaurant closed the door and walked around to the driver's seat. The engine started. The air conditioning was running, making the interior of the car almost cold after the heat outside. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the enforcer spoke. He said that Tony Giacalone sent his apologies for not being there personally. Something had come up that required his attention elsewhere. But Tony had wanted this conversation to happen today, and he'd asked the enforcer to deliver a message. Hoffa asked what message. The enforcer said that some people were concerned. The federal investigation into Hoffa was intensifying. Robert Kennedy wasn't going to stop until he had Hoffa in prison. And when people were looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary, they sometimes made decisions they wouldn't normally make. They sometimes decided that cooperation was better than prison. Hoffa said he would never cooperate. Everyone who knew him knew that. He wasn't a rat and never would be. The enforcer nodded. He said that Tony believed that. A lot of people believed that, but not everyone. Some families thought the risk was too great. They thought the safest solution was to eliminate the risk entirely, permanently. The words hung in the air. Hoffa understood what was being said without it being spelled out. Some people in the mob wanted him dead, and they wanted it to happen sooner rather than later, before the feds could corner him. He asked if Tony was one of those people. The enforcer said no. Tony believed Hoffa was too valuable to lose. Tony believed they could weather this storm if everyone stayed smart and stayed loyal. But Tony was just one voice. Other voices were calling for a different solution. Hoffa asked what Tony expected him to do. The enforcer said Tony expected him to be careful, to understand that the situation was more dangerous than it had been before, to know that protection wasn't guaranteed anymore, that old relationships and old agreements might not mean what they used to mean. The enforcer said that this meeting, this conversation, was Tony's way of giving Hoffa a warning, a heads up, a chance to understand where things stood before it was too late. Then he said something that made Hoffa's blood run cold. He said that next time it might not be Tony making the decision. Next time, there might not be a warning. The car stopped. They were back at the Red Fox, parked near Hoffa's car. The driver got out and opened Hoffa's door. The enforcer told him to be smart, to watch his back, and to remember this conversation. Hoffa got out of the car. The Lincoln drove away, leaving him standing alone in the parking lot. His hands were shaking. Not much, but enough that he noticed. He'd been in dangerous situations before, but something about this felt different. This felt like the world had shifted under his feet, like the rules he'd operated by his entire career might not apply anymore. He got in his car and drove back to his office. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not Chucky, not his lawyer, not his wife. He kept it to himself, turned it over in his mind, tried to figure out what it meant and what he should do about it. Over the next 11 years, Hoffa fought to survive. The federal government convicted him of jury tampering and fraud. He went to prison in 1967. In 1971, President Nixon commuted his sentence, but with a condition. Hoffa couldn't participate in union activities until 1980. For Hoffa, that was unacceptable. The Teamsters were his life, his identity, his power base. Being forced out, even temporarily, was like being forced to stop breathing. He began working behind the scenes to overturn the restriction, to find a way back into union leadership. Some people in the mob were worried about this. They'd gotten comfortable with the new Teamsters leadership, had established relationships and arrangements that worked well for them. Hoffa coming back would disrupt that. And disruption was dangerous. On July 30th, 1975, exactly 11 years after that meeting in the Lincoln, Jimmy Hoffa went to the Red Fox restaurant again. He was supposed to meet with Tony Giacalone and Anthony Provenzano, another mob-connected Teamster official. It was supposed to be a meeting to smooth over differences, to discuss Hoffa's plans for returning to power, to see if they could all find a way to work together. Hoffa arrived at 2:30 p.m. He waited in the parking lot. Tony Giacalone never showed up. Anthony Provenzano never showed up. Nobody showed up. At 2:45 p.m., Hoffa called his wife from a payphone. He said the people he was supposed to meet hadn't arrived yet. He sounded annoyed but not concerned. He said he'd wait a little longer. That was the last time anyone heard from Jimmy Hoffa. The FBI investigation that followed became one of the most extensive missing persons cases in American history. They searched everywhere, interviewed hundreds of people, pursued countless leads. They dug up fields, demolished buildings, drained ponds. They never found his body. They never found definitive proof of what happened to him. But people who knew that world, who understood how it worked, had a pretty good idea. Jimmy Hoffa had been warned. On July 30th, 1964, sitting in that black Lincoln in the parking lot of the Red Fox, he'd been told that the rules were changing, that his position wasn't as secure as it used to be, that next time there might not be a warning. 11 years later, to the day, he found out what next time meant. The man who'd sat across from him in that Lincoln, who'd delivered Tony Giacalone's message, who'd given him that warning, had been telling the truth. There wasn't a warning the second time. There wasn't a meeting to explain things. There wasn't a chance to negotiate or find a solution. There was just a phone call that was never made, a body that was never found, in a parking lot where Jimmy Hoffa's car sat abandoned until someone from his family came to pick it up. To this day, people argue about what happened. Some say he was shot and buried. Some say his body was cremated. Some say it was dumped in a river or lake. Some say he's buried under a football stadium or a parking lot or a highway. The truth is that nobody knows for sure, and maybe that's the point. Maybe the people who took Jimmy Hoffa didn't just want him dead. Maybe they wanted him to disappear, to become a question mark, to serve as a permanent reminder of what happens when you don't listen to warnings. Because in that world, in the world Jimmy Hoffa lived in and ultimately died in, warnings weren't suggestions. They were the last bit of respect you got before respect stopped mattering. And Jimmy Hoffa, who'd spent his life refusing to back down, refusing to show fear, refusing to let anyone push him around, learned that there's a difference between courage and immortality. On July 30th, 1964, he walked out of that parking lot. On July 30th, 1975, he didn't. That's the real story. Not a legend, not a myth. Just a warning that came true.